But this is a story about our own history. I look around and everybody has gray hair, fortunately. But that's part of our story. And it's been totally buried. It's been totally buried. So that's going back to my motivation. I was a participant in May 70, but there's no book about it. Not one book. Not one movie, not one film or documentary. So I knew then that when I discovered that. So the reason it's so big, that I went back to the original. Is that Fran? Hi, welcome, welcome. Join us. I just started, Fran, so you're lucky or unlucky, depending on. But so yeah, I started looking into doing research for this, and I wanted to do this years and years and years ago because I was a participant, and I've known that there's been a very huge lack of anything written or on film or anything about what happened. And we're all familiar with the Kent State murders, right, Fran? You're familiar with the Kent State murders.
Indeed.
But I just went to I had a medical procedure done at a medical center, and my young technicians, they had no idea what I was talking about when I started talking about May 70 and the murders at Kent State. They knew nothing about it, which is kind of true for most of us. We're familiar with the Kent State murders, even those of us who were around then, but that's about it. That's about it. And the Kent State killings were just the tip of the iceberg. So I spent a few years, and I'd go to the original newsletters and newspapers of students. They're written by participants and observers, and just jotted down what they wrote about. Fran, look at the size of this. Look at this, 682 pages. Anyhow, they wouldn't print it in one volume, so they forced me to do two. And it's heavy paper, so they're heavy. But there are a lot of stories in here. There's a lot of stories about San Diego, UCSD, San Diego State. And now, in May 9th, 1970, thousands of your fellow students took part in a civil disobedient action up on Catalina, in front of the old former Naval Electronics Laboratory. Everybody remember that, NEL? Mm-hmm. So for hours, we stopped NEL from working, from operating. NEL was a huge naval electronics facility. Thousands of workers worked there. UCSD had a contract there. So a lot of stories about UCSD, San Diego State, NEL, but across the country. I started in the Northeast, I started in Maine, and every chapter just goes through the country, and it's by date. So I go region by region, state by state, campus to campus, telling this story that's never been freaking told before. And why? That's a big question. Why hasn't this been told? But so it's a day-to-day, day-by-day story, narrative. And there's a bunch of people that I quoted. A bunch of people. Steve Wimmers is quoted in here. Kate Bell is quoted in here. Peter Bulmer, Mike Williams. Some of us know Mike Williams. He's quoted. And they're all quoted because they were active in May 70. Lo and behold, I didn't know this until I asked friends, if they had been involved, and some of them had. So I took their stories, and I've been collecting those stories for a while, and most of them are in here. So why the book? There's a huge gap in our understanding of what happened during this period. And I showed Jeff Page a couple chapters, and he read, and he said, this is amazing, and it's going to change the way we view this period of history. And I love that phrase so much I included it in my intro in the back, but I'm not going to get any royalties.
You're not going to see my name on there.
Yeah, no name, no royalties. But it's true. The murders of the 4 students at Kent State were just the iceberg. And this book forever changed the way the history of that period is viewed. So that's why I wrote it, because there was nothing out there, not a documentary. So, no historical society took it upon themselves, no media platform, nobody took it upon themselves to figure out what happened. So the book is based upon contemporaneously written observations and reporting by students, okay, who were there. So it's raw research. So I went to 700 separate colleges and looked at their archives. Actually, the archives were held by Kent State. And Kent State collected the archives, or in their archives, they collected newsletters and newspapers of all the campuses, hundreds. So I went to 700 of those, checked out their newsletters, their sympathetic student newspapers, and copied those reports. And that's what we have now. So it's very detailed, it's day by day, and God, those planes. So when I say the Kent State murders were just the tip of the iceberg, I really mean that. If you look at the numbers, hey, that bird almost hit the plane. Nobody noticed. Nobody knows. So, but the numbers are substantial, and they show you the depth and the breadth and you know how broad this movement was for a month. So our colleagues, and some of us are involved, you know, rose up, and the people rose up with, as we all remember, Nixon invaded Cambodia, and he had just, like a month earlier, when he announced that on April 30th, 1970, troop withdrawal from Vietnam. And then he announced, lo and behold, that he's invading another country. So our peers, rightly and wisely, saw that as expansion of the Vietnam War, which is totally, I mean, Nixon won in '68 because he promised peace. A month before he announced the invasion of Cambodia, he announced the troop withdrawals from Vietnam. So people were saying, what the fuck? And the campuses blew up immediately. So, and the numbers are incredible. We all know about the 4 murders of students at Kent State. Now, 2 of them weren't even protesting. One was a ROTC cadet, one of the best in his class. You know, and he'd gone out to check the demonstrations, turned around, was heading back to class when he was hit in the back. A woman who was going the way to class didn't have a political bone in her body. Boom, she's on the way to class and she's hit. So now there's all kinds of stories about what happened, and they're very terrific and horrible. The ambulances took a long time getting there. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, as I'm saying. So what else happened? Well, over the month, there's 8 deaths. There's 4 at Kent State, 2 young men at Jackson State. One wasn't even a student, were killed by the police. And there was 2 self-immolations. George Winnie at UCSD burned himself up in protest of the war. And another young man burned himself up in the Midwest because of the war. Hardly anybody knows about that second death. So we're talking about 8 deaths directly related to what happened in May 70. Now, besides that, you know, there was birdshot fired and bayoneting, and 1,300 young people were wounded or injured, you know, during the month. And that doesn't even count the people who suffered tear gas and went home just to, you know, get rid of it, or who were injured somehow but just went home and didn't report it. So 1,400 people were reported injuries or woundings. 4,500 young people were arrested during the month. And that sounds like a lot. It is a lot. And it broke all kinds of records. Now, it's been broken since, but that was a lot of people back then. And the National Guard at the University of New Mexico, somebody went here, Dan went there a couple of years before it happened, but the National Guard bayoneted 12 people, almost killing 2 people. If they hadn't gone to the emergency room right away, at least one of them would have died.
Where was that, Frank?
University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. And everybody's heard of birdshot and buckshot. Anybody know what that's like? Birdshot and buckshot, they're small, but they were used on four different campuses, and 24 people were wounded. If you get a birdshot pellet in your eye, you're blind. So on 4 different campuses, 24 people were wounded by bird or buckshot. And there's 14 people wounded by the National Guard with bayonets, including 2 reporters. So this is crazy stuff. Now, the some people say, well, the Kent State deaths, they could have been prevented if they hadn't been, rioting or demonstrating. But people like Steve Wimmers, our good friend Steve Wimmers, some of us know him real well. He went to Ohio State in Athens, or was it Columbus? Might be Columbus.
Ohio State's in Columbus.
Okay, yeah.
I was in Cleveland.
There's more violence, more trashings, more, battles, rock and bottle throwing, conflicts with National Guards and cops, and it happened there. So I make the case, I don't linger on it long, but I make the case that the Kent State deaths actually prevented more lives being lost. And the reason that's true is because right after Kent State, governors, mayors, National Guard commanders all had second thoughts about handing out live ammunition to their troops. So there was a general easing of both the rhetoric and the ammunition. So my point is, if it hadn't happened at Kent State on May 4th, it could have happened at the University of Buffalo. It could have happened at the University of New Mexico. It could have happened at the University of Ohio. It could have happened at a dozen campuses where the National Guards were. But because Kent State, it didn't. And my point is that they lowered the rhetoric, they lowered the amount of ammunition being passed out. Or it could have happened at Kent State on May 5th, the next day. They were killed on May 4th. It could have happened the next day. So the point being, their deaths, tragic and horrible as they were, probably saved lives. And it's a sad commentary on the moment, but that's probably what happened. So this is that story. This is a narrative. This is a journey through time, and it's so thick because it's very, very detailed. Now, there's some funny stories in here. It's not all dread and dreary and violence. There's some actual funny stuff that you'll be reading and you'll break out laughing out loud because of the ridiculousness of the situation. For example, there's this one Midwest university. A couple thousand kids were out in the field. They had lowering the American flag to half staff was a big deal because the kids wanted to honor the 4 Kent State kids killed. So they would lower the flag, but they ran into so much grief. In fact, one governor threatened to call the National Guard just because the kids wanted to lower the flag. That's craziness. And it goes to tell you how things work. But this one instance where the kids were out in the field and they lowered the flag, and then just all of a sudden they were surrounded by cops and National Guards and trucks and jeeps and administrators, and the kids had decided that they would not fight the law enforcement. They let it all happen peacefully. So the kids were surrounded, right? You got to picture this. The kids are in this big field. The flagpole is in the middle of the field. Now the flag's down to half staff. They're surrounded by troops and guards and cops. So they just were going to let whatever happen. So they allowed some administrators to come up, and the administrators had this janitor come up, lower the flag, right? And then raise it back up, but he also raised the state flag. But the kids saw it. Nobody said a word. The state flag was upside down, So it's funnier when you read about it. Another time, the students had lowered the flag, and the campus was invaded by about 100 hard hats, organized by somebody, and they charged on campus. They roughed people up, and they pushed away the campus security. They rushed over the flagpole, raised it back up, and they made a big announcement that if the students lowered again, they would be back, and they were going to come back with more people and arms at noon. And they left. So people were, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? So everybody was shaken up. So the kids say, we're going to protect the flagpole when they come back. So a bunch of professors had the idea of surrounding the flagpole with trucks and jeeps, not jeeps, but cars. So they surrounded the flagpole. The chancellor called, or the university president called for help from the police departments. And most of the police departments would not respond, but this one department did. And they sent like a platoon of cops to come protect. So you had the scene. They have a ring of steel around the flagpole. Everybody's waiting for the hard hats to come back, So you had cops, students, academics, all on one side, ready to fight the hard hats. Noon came, 15 minutes passed, they didn't show. So this whole scene was kind of a comedy of errors, but it just shows you the intensity of what was going on. Now the flags, lowering the flag to half staff, that means you have some respect for the flag. That means you have some, a willingness to use the flag to honor dead students. So that was a big issue. At least 43 campuses, that was an issue where blows would come and people would fight over the flag and administrators would lose their mind. There was only 4 campuses where American flags were burned. And so what that tells you is that, you had the scene of radical hippies rioting and burning American flags. Well, it's an incorrect image. The main thing was that most students wanted the flags lowered to half staff to honor people that were killed. And then remember the hard hat riot in New York City?
Yeah, I was there.
You were there. So hard hats, several hundred hard hat workers were organized, and at the time the labor head was a very pro-Nixon guy, and they launched a riot against these peaceful protesters and beat people up and sent a lot of the hospital. And so the hard hat riot is really, really famous. For some people, New York City, it was right on Wall Street. So there was a sense that similar scenes would happen across the country. It's a real fear that these hard hat guys would riot and cause trouble for the peaceniks. But it didn't really happen. So that was good. But one of the things that I outline in the book is the extreme racial divide during that time, 1970. I mean, we have it today, but think about what happened back then. And it really came true when so everybody was upset about what happened to National Guard at Kent State, and the guards fired 67 shots. It's all been documented, it's in books. The Scranton report talked about it. But then a couple weeks later, a similar thing happened at an all-black school at Jackson State. And the cops there fired hundreds of rounds. And they were shooting into a girls' dormitory, and they killed 2 young men. One was just passing by. He didn't go to school there, wounding a whole bunch of people, but they riddled the building with gunshots, bullet holes. And the students there wouldn't let anybody in to, they wouldn't let anybody in to take evidence except the FBI, because they thought there'd be a big cover-up, which was true. Because right after the shootings, eyewitnesses report say after the cops shot into the women's dorm, they went around collecting their bullet casings to take, get away, excuse me, get rid of the proof. So, but this big racial divide was also evidenced in in the middle of May, there was a big riot in Augusta, Georgia, and the town there was really, the African Americans there were being really badly treated, as we can kind of imagine. Employment rates were down, education rates were down. Some parts of the city didn't even have sewers or roads. Big discrimination happening. And this young black man, he was 16, he had some mental issues. He was captured by the cops and beaten, and he was killed. And they brought his body to the morgue, and he had been tortured. And the cops said, oh, he just fell off his top bunk and hit his head. He was tortured with his cigarette burns all over his body. His back of his head was crushed. He had all these marks from whipping on his back. So they knew something had happened. So the people of Augusta, Georgia rose up. They couldn't get straight answers from the local white officials. So they rioted. And Governor Maddox brought in cops, and there's no tear gas, no warnings, no birdshot, no buckshot, just straight bullets. And they just fired into the crowds, killing 6 black men, all shot in the back. And it was a horrible, horrible scene. But what it shows in high relief the racial divide in the country at that time. Despite the racial divide and the outright racism and white supremacy that was all over the country, our generation were one of the first generations of white students to reject the racial discrimination that we're all ingrained with. Most of us are ingrained with, from the get-go, from when we're young kids. And if you remember, the Black Panthers, the Black Panther Party were around then. In fact, they were probably at the height in 1970 of their, they had hundreds of chapters, they had a national newspaper, they made a name for themselves because they wore guns. They tried to prevent the Oakland cops from harassing their community. Ronald Reagan freaked out. J. Edgar Hoover called them the biggest threat in the country. But they got a lot of press and they got a lot of support from whites and also from white lefties and also from their community. So the Black Panthers were a big issue in 1970. And they were one of the demands. They were one of the demands to get the government not to go after Bobby Seale, the chairman of the Black Panthers at the time. He was on trial for murder in New Haven. To me, that means that our generation of white students were one of the first generations to reject, the racial supremacy, and with our support of the Black Panthers, our support for universities and colleges to enact black studies departments, more black professors, more black students, more black administrators, that support for those reforms shows, I think, that, we broke with that old tradition, that old racist tradition. And around the same time, women's liberation was growing, and a lot of the campuses had feminist groups form. And so one of my points is that the atmosphere created by the strike and all the protests allowed people, blacks on one hand, women students on the other, to expand their rights, expand their programs, their studies, their departments, more women professors, more women in administrators. So that was a big deal too. So gender and racial reforms were kind of in the background, but the strike allowed them to come to the foreground. And in addition, students' rights. Now we all know about a lot of us know about the Berkeley Free Speech Movement, the FSM. And a lot of us went to colleges where where students' rights were upheld. But a lot of colleges didn't have that, where the tide of reform from Berkeley didn't hit their campus. And a lot of them had administrators who didn't believe in the Bill of Rights, didn't believe in constitutional rights, and they really treated their students badly, arresting students or having a peaceful rally, preventing them from even gathering. So a lot of schools where that was true, during May 70, those reforms were sweeping through. So now I was a participant at UCSD. I was married. I was in the married student department, so I was getting a degree in sociology. And when the day Kent State happened, I was at a sit-in at Urey Hall, if you know UCSD at all. And I try to remember how people's reactions were when they heard about the Kent State killings on the radio. And I think the laughter died down and any frivolity died down, but we stood our ground. We stayed there. And I think the attitude was, well, we could be next. So it was that kind of determination, I think, that swept the country. So 700 campuses shut down. 1,400 campuses were deeply affected by what happened. So there's important lessons from that experience, and I talked about some of them in here. One thing, the students learned lessons. They learned their extent of their. They learned how they could be organizers and writers and speechifiers and people who could manage logistics. People learned that from the experience of the strike, but administrators and cops also learned stories too. They learned lessons. They learned to coordinate, because once a university called in the cops, they lost all moral high ground, and they lost the ability to control their campus. Which is kind of interesting that administrators did. After the dust died down, people started looking at campuses and trying to decide, what can we do so there's no more mass protests? So they looked at these traditional mass gathering areas, big grassy areas, and they started breaking them up with stone walls and gardens, and they started building more administration buildings with all glass so they could see what's inside, they could see who's inside, what they're doing. So they made changes to a lot of the campuses because of May 70. Now, okay, so the book proves that the cover-up is over, and I asked the question, why? And there really is no answer. I mean, why hasn't there been anybody taken upon themselves to uncover all of this history? It's an important history, it's an important chapter of our history, and they haven't done it. Nobody did it. Why? And I don't really answer the question. I speculate. So why has there been such a cover-up? Okay, so we can understand the whole Nixon era. Okay, that ended. The Watergate ended. That whole era. But why hasn't anything happened since? We can understand the Vietnam War is built on lies. The Nixon administration is built on lies. So, maybe that's why it happened. That period of time, we didn't have the social media we have today. And we had a journalist, and I.F. Stone, the famous journalist, found out that at both Kent State and Jackson State, the two murder places, cops all conspired together to give the FBI false narratives of what happened. So I.F. Stone broke the news that this was going on. So how can we expect the truth to come out when the most dire incidences are surrounded by lies and false narratives? So I just, throw up my hands and say we don't know and we can just speculate. But it happens to be that this has happened in other places in our history where important outbreaks of people's rebellion is covered up. It happened everywhere, but like it happened in 1877 at the famous railroad workers strike. It happened, through the ethnic cleansing policies of the government with our native populations. It happened in massacres of black communities. It happened in Shays Rebellion. Anybody remember Shays Rebellion? So there's been other instances in our history where there's been huge cover-ups, and I end up saying that what happened in May 70 was so horrific and so violent, and why would the establishment want to publicize a time when a motley group of students brought the entire higher education system to a halt, creating an unprecedented crisis for the establishment? Why would they want to broadcast that story? They don't. So we have to. It's our history. Now, the significance, I get into what happened to the rebels, and I get into the significance of what happened, and I'm not boring you with all the details because you can read about it here. But the rebellion did bring the troops out of Cambodia sooner than Nixon had first thought or planned. It did lead to Congress exerting itself back into the war policy making powers that they had, and there's all kinds of bills that were before Congress. So, but the kids, our students, did this. Dozens of campuses sent out students who went door to door with flyers and petitions about the war, about their strike. And over time, we can see polls basically showing the American people basically coming out in support of the students. I talk about polls just like in late '69, you got 77% support Nixon, but gradually over the next couple of years, those numbers come way down, and it's particularly after the rebellion, most Americans wanted our troops to come out of Vietnam, and obviously we're already out of Cambodia, but out of the whole Southeast Asia. So we did that. Our generation did that. We convinced enough of our fellow Americans to say this is bullshit and bring the troops home, finally. And I talk about the end of the war, the end of the draft, the Paris Peace Accords, but also you know, May 70 changed America, changed our politics, and changed the rest of us forever. And it helped build the Vietnam syndrome, where there was an aversion to ground troops by any president, you know, for a couple of decades. That they were, you know, did that Vietnam syndrome disallowed, you know, presidents from just charging into any country they wanted to. and also, we all remember Watergate, but I make the point here, and I'm not the only one, that Watergate started, Nixon started the slide down to Watergate because of May 70. He was so outraged by, well, first of all, he wanted the FBI to find the agitators who caused the Kent State, you know, massacre. And of course there weren't any. And so he turned to his plumbers unit. In other words, he turned to other illegal and off-the-book solutions. And as we all know, that led to the Watergate break-in. There was more than one break-in, by the way. There was a whole bunch of break-ins, and they only got caught once. But that, you know, split everything open. And then the Watergate hearings started in '73. And by the end of those Watergate hearings, we knew about the war, the horrors at White House, all the dirty tricks. You know, Nixon wanted to bomb the Brookings Institute. He wanted to go after Daniel Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers along with Anthony Russo. So the point is that the resistance shown in May 70 forced Nixon into a place where it ended up committing all these illegal stuff with COINTEL. You know, Black Panthers was assassinated, peaceniks and lefties were harassed and abused. But at the end, after he defeated McGovern, remember McGovern, the peace candidate? There was a whole wave of peace candidates who came out of 70, 71, and 72. Of course, you know, McGovern was totally smashed. But Nixon, just a year or two later, is gone. He resigned August 74. So, point is, the rebellion helped force Nixon out, but it also forced a lot of changes to the country that we still see today. Cheryl, take care. There's a couple lessons for us in this Trump era. We've all heard reports how Trump wants to use the military to, you know, control people, particularly if he wants to deport millions of people. He'll use the military to help with that. We know people are not going to go, or they're not going to see people go peacefully, and he's threatened to use the military to stop Americans from resisting his plans. Now, we already know what happens when the government shoots Americans, particularly white Americans. We know from history, our history, it created unprecedented crisis for the establishment. We brought the higher education system to a halt. But that's what will happen. That's what's going to happen. It's going to cause such a crisis in the Trump administration that we're going to see a lot of people get upset. Now, there's another thing. Doing this research in my own memory, I recall that there was those times were very divisive. Can you remember back when you were in the 20s, in your 20s? It was not it wasn't an easy time to being young. There was a big divide in this country between the Nixonites, between peaceniks. Try to remember what it was like. It was very bad back then. Here's an example. One of the students who went to Kent State went home after the shootings and after the campus was closed down. He went home and talked to his mother. What she had to say shocked him. Pause. So this kid from Kent State goes home, talks to his mother, and she says, "Oh, they should have shot everybody." And he says, "Mom, you're talking about me. I was there." She said, "Yeah, I know. They should have mowed everybody down. It would have been good for the country." This is in 1970. I mean, there was a divide there. And, you know, right after the shootings at Kent State, they took polls across Ohio, the state where it happened, and most polls blamed the students. You know, so the lesson for us there is that even though we were divided to a huge extent, our perseverance, our humanity allowed us to survive, and that's what's going to happen now. You know, we're going to be around, And when Trump starts to pull his worst stuff, our American citizens, our fellow citizens, are going to rebel. They're not going to take it. And why? Why do we know this? We know from our own history. Americans are not going to sit down and stay quiet if they start killing other Americans with the military. I think we don't have a proof of that, but that's what I think is going to happen. So America was deeply changed by what happened in May 70, and it affected all of us. I talk about what happened to all the radicals, what happened to all the rebels, you know. And my sense is that thousands, do you know that thousands of young people were involved? There was hundreds of thousands of young people involved. There was 1 to 4 million students involved in May 70. That's a lot of people. So I want to urge you to get a copy, read about our history. I'm not making money on this. I didn't do it for money, as Patty would know. I was so disappointed. I wanted to get this out for the 50th anniversary of Kent State. I totally failed. And Patty, I was bemoaning the fact that I had failed, and Patty said, well, you know, you wrote this for posterity. You know, you didn't write this for anybody. You didn't write it for May 2024, 2020. You wrote it for posterity. So I continued on, and 5.5 years later, this is what I got. During the middle of it, I realized that I was like Dr. Frankenstein. I had created a monster, and I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop, Bill. You know, writing in the middle of this, and now you're a big book writer, but I couldn't stop. You know, the monster was created, and I couldn't control it, so I had to let it be born. So
It's very detailed, which is great.
it is very, very detailed, and because we need that history.
Yeah.
So it's not a novel. It's not a historical novel. It's like a resource book. And the weakness of it, there's no index, but there is an end of chapter notes, but there's no, if I had put an index in there, it would have been another $2,000 in another year, and I couldn't face that. So I'm sorry, Jeff, there's no index. But, so don't remember, your friends are quoted in here, other people, your generation are quoted in here. It's just our history. It's our history. So listen, I'm not going to say anything more. I'll answer any questions. You know, I'd do it again, sure. But 5.5 years? Poor Patty. She had to suffer through all of that. No, they didn't learn anything. The stuff we did was a lot heavier.
Yeah.
And the stuff the kids did this time around so light, and they came down on them so violently. You know, it's crazy. They haven't learned anything. No, they haven't. And it's too bad.
Well, the universities have really doubled down.